Thank you all for attending today. The first thing that I want to point out is that this presentation is intended for technical communicators who have a basic level of familiarity with translation and localization but would like to learn more. So, if you're not sure if you should be here or not, I will use what we call the Localization Maturity Model as my guide. Like the Capability Maturity Model, the Localization Maturity Model has 5 similar levels. The first level is the one in which the company either gets a request from a customer or perhaps an internal decision is made that the product needs to be localized. All activities are in reaction to this request, and as often happens, the documentation department is tasked with, if not all the undertaking, at least the localization of the documentation. If this is where you are, then you're in the right place. Additionally, if you're currently tasked with at least the documentation localization and you have had a part in choosing vendors and deciding criteria for success and have done this before, then you are no doubt reaching level 2. And again, you're in the right place. If your company has a localization department and you are included in the discussions about the processes and how to optimize the documentation for localization and even have some input into the UI, then again, you're in the right place. If any of this describes you or your organization, then you're in the right place. If you are, however, an experienced localization engineer, then we invite you to our next webinar as well. For those of you who are attending your first webinar with me, my name is David Sommer, and I am the Director of Strategic Operations for Net Translators. I've been in localization for most of the past decade and have previously worked for the software testing labs of an international standards body. Prior to my current position, and for the better part of a decade, I was a localization project manager, having worked on projects of every size and shape imaginable. I want to share with you over the next hour a small part of what I have learned that can be helpful to you if you are a technical communicator tasked with some level of involvement in localization for your organization. If any of you have questions during the course of this webinar, please send them to webinar@nettranslators.com as it appears on this page, and we will try to at least answer some of them at the conclusion of this presentation. In addition, you can also send them by questions or via the chat window, and we'll try to answer them as well. What we're going to deal with today are some of the issues that you might have encountered and try to make sense of them for you. I think that this quote really sums up what localization is about. When I think about what I do for a living, well, I don't say, gee, I'm the DSO for Net Translators. I think rather that I help people gain access to the best products in the world that can help them communicate better, live better, and get access to health care that he or she may not otherwise be able to get. So, to go over briefly a small lexicon of terms before we start, and these are only a small collection of the terms you might encounter or have encountered in the past. So I'm just going to go through them briefly. Alignment is the task of aligning legacy content that has been translated, but the translations are not stored in any repository for reuse. Alignment allows you to create reusable translations based upon what you have translated in the past. Bi-di refers to bidirectional text, essentially mixing left to right and right to left scripts. CAT tools are used by human translators to support and facilitate the translation process, thus creating reusable translations, increasing efficiency and quality, and helping to speed up the translation process. CJK refers to the 3 main Asian languages, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. In regards to exact matches and fuzzy matches, we will examine those a little more closely today. FIGS is an abbreviation for French, Italian, German, and Spanish, 4 of the major European languages. In-country refers to any resource that is found in the target language country. XLIF, or XML Localization Interchange File Format, is an XML-based format created to standardize the way localizable data are passed between the tools during a localization process. In effect, it increases the interoperability of the localization tools. The remainder of the terms we will look at in more depth shortly. So, this is more or less what the software localization process looks like. But what I'd like to do now is I'm going to try and break down the sections into smaller chunks so we can digest these easier. Then later on we'll come back to this chart so we can walk through it together. I would like to begin really in the middle with the translation and then go back to the beginning. By looking at the translation and then expanding outward, we can have a good grasp on some of the complexity of this undertaking. Essentially, the translation process can be broken down into 4 stages: preparation, translation, review, and post-process. The preparation includes activities such as file preparation. This means essentially deconstructing a file to strip it of the non-translation related elements. Typically, formats may include for documentation formats such as Word, Excel, PowerPoint, InDesign, FrameMaker, or even PDF or non-editable formats. As for software, these may include PO files, regex, Java properties files, even DLLs or plain text, and so on. Some file formats require very little preparation by engineering resources, and others may be more complex and require more effort. Terminology work involves the identification, extraction, and translation of industry and proprietary terms in order to ensure correct translation, as well as support corporate brand image, much in the same way a style guide would. I will talk a little bit more in depth about this shortly. TM leverage refers to the ability to leverage past translations from a repository called a translation memory. This increases efficiencies, reduces costs, shortens timelines, and improves quality. The TM is integrated normally in the translation kit in order to be able to send this translation kit to the language resources. Those language resources must of course possess the correct CAT tool set in order to make full use of the terminology database, which also should be integrated into the translation bundle or translation kit. The translator has to make sure that the message that is being conveyed is consistent not only with itself, but with the customer as well. For instance, you wouldn't want to use the same type of language for a diabetes pump as you would for a casual mobile game. Good query management is crucial furthermore to ensuring that there is an effective communication between the language resources and that all queries are disseminated across all languages. Once the translation is completed, it is then sent for review by an independent reviewer who checks the translation according to a strict set of criteria. In addition, the resources that are discovered are then, the issues that are discovered are then recorded in order to create a mechanism for continuous improvement. If any of you present attended my previous webinar, this is precisely the place where we begin to measure the quality. After translation, engineering then performs a series of operations on the files. These operations include automated quality tests, target file generation. In other words, if I'm translating a Word document, I need to give back a Word document. This is referred to as DTP. If these are software resource files, then the targets are generated and passed on for compilation of the software and later testing. So now we understand a little bit more of the translation process. But the internationalization and localization that go on perhaps before translation are equally critical. To make this simple, internationalization includes all the things you do to the software to make sure that it can support the targets. Typically, internationalization, if done correctly and with enough foresight to include future needs, should be a one-time effort. So, for example, you would need to take into account all those locales that you not only want to localize into now, but those potential markets in the future. This is significant because if your company plans to expand in Western Europe, then this is only one type of test that needs to be undertaken. If, however, there is tucked somewhere a plan to expand to Middle Eastern markets, then issues such as text direction would need to be considered. So let's look for a moment at the items that you would need to look at in the internationalization phase. Text inputting and support. For non-English characters, this is typically enabled using the Unicode standard, which includes 110,000 characters and supports over 100 scripts. What does this mean to you? Well, essentially, if your product is not using the Unicode standard, you're probably going to have some problems. The writing direction. We're all pretty spoiled in this regard. We think that the world revolves around us, but there are almost 500 million Arabic speakers in the world, and this is across more than 30 countries where it is an official language. That is a large potential market not to be ready for. Keep in mind, too, that it is one of the 6 official UN languages. The others are English, French, Spanish, Chinese, and Russian. There are a myriad of other challenges when considering right-to-left languages. Other languages would include Hebrew, Farsi, and Urdu, for instance. I just want to point out here that the screen is not stuck. I just had a few things to add here. In terms of text processing, often this is overlooked. But let's say you're developing a program for graphic artists. You would need to make sure that all the various permutations of characters are supported if you want to succeed. For example, let's say for a moment that you were going to sell your product in 5 languages, what we call e-figs: English, French, Italian, German, and Spanish. And that is the extent of your commitment to these languages. But you need to think for a moment that in today's world, a graphic artist might just be creating content for other locales as well. So they might well need to have the software support inputting of languages such as Czech, Greek, Romanian, etc. These languages have unique attributes and need to be taken into consideration. What things might you have to consider? Well, for example, can I copy from a website or Excel file or MS Word doc and paste it into the program and still have it present correctly? Can I create PDFs and have the characters render as they should? Can I cut and paste from my software into other applications? These are all issues which need to be considered and are completely independent of the localization or translation. In terms of cultural and regional issues, while it's popular to consider the urban legend about the Chevy Nova, that is, that it didn't sell well in South America because the name Nova means doesn't go in Spanish, and this, by the way, is a debunked myth, or the issues about different colors meaning different things, and yes, this is true. But the real important issues would need to be checked are things such as support for different currencies, presentation of numbers using the correct separators. I tried, for instance, to order some electronic gadgets from a site in Hong Kong that claimed that it would provide free shipping anywhere, specifically to my country. So I happily shopped, and then when I got to the checkout, it would not accept the telephone number format. I tried every permutation, but eventually gave up. And this is something that I see time and again with commercial websites. Other things you might consider is how to present weights and measures. Can your program meet the regional needs, or are you stuck in feet and inches? Other issues in internationalization you might want to consider may be your technical authoring environment. It's great that you use FrameMaker, but does it support your target languages, or are you going to have to invest after you've written your content in a very expensive localization process, or change your authoring tool down the road to something else? And we all know what the costs of changing are, both in direct terms, as well as the associated costs when considering loss of TM leveraging. This means that your segmentation will change, and you will pay more to translate the same content. So you really need to take this into consideration. I'm reminded of a customer that was working in 20-plus languages in FrameMaker. One of the languages was Arabic, so their vendor built a very expensive method to get FrameMaker to support Arabic. They are now not only stuck with that vendor, since the cost of moving would be high, but they are stuck with a very old version of FrameMaker, since the adaptation will not work with the newer versions of the FrameMaker. Internationalization entails a holistic approach and needs to be well thought out by the entire team. So if all these things are what you do in internationalization, what are the things you do for localization? Well, localization entails doing things over and over again in order to get the local product out. Examples of this would be translation, localization testing including functional, cosmetic, and linguistic testing, creating specific local content, making sure that local addresses, phone formats are corrected if you're localizing, for example, your website. So how does localization differ from translation? Well, here we see an example of what might very well be a good translation job, but in effect is a bad localization job. Looking at this graphic, and I really have to apologize in advance because I actually did use this in the previous webinar, but I liked it so much that I decided I was going to use it again today. You'll notice here that the page is translated into Spanish, and I have no doubt that it's correct, but the issue is that the locale is set to Jamaica, which is an English-speaking member of the British Commonwealth and a former colony. So this emphasizes that localization is about more than translation. And with my apologies to Oracle, I wanted to use their site as an example of issues that include localization. This is from the country landing pages for Russia and France. The 3 examples shown by the arrows indicate the following. The solutions. This shows that whereas the Russian site for this item is localized, the French is not. Sign-in. This shows the opposite. In other words, the French is localized, whereas the Russian is not. The search function issue may even be an internationalization issue if this string, for example, wasn't externalized, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Finally, of course, the French graphic is localized and the Russian is not. The localization does not only mean, of course, that the content was translated, but more that it was laid out in a locale-friendly manner and looks as if it were written with that locale in mind. So what other specifics can we mention about internationalization? Let's look for a moment at some specific activities associated with the internationalization. As mentioned previously, it is important to look at the variety of markets that your product will foreseeably enter. When creating an internationalized piece of software, you need to look at details such as field length for street addresses, unique formats for the address, ability to make the zip code field optional to address countries that do not have zip codes, use of identifiers such as social security number rather than a national health insurance number, and so on. In this example from Southwest Airlines, while they did consider, and you'll see that down here by that big arrow, while they did consider the need to allow a phone number that was not a U.S. cell number, they assumed that everyone would understand that 011 is the international access number. Most countries in the world, however, recognize that the plus sign indicates the international access dialing number. You'll notice, by the way, that Southwest.com is translated and localized into Spanish. I apologize. I have just been notified that nobody saw this screen, so I'm going to go through it again. On the bottom part, we see the area that requires, if you're outside the U.S., for you to enter your cell phone number. Here is an indicator of international dialing access. Now, 011 is international dialing access for the United States. However, most countries, as I just mentioned, most people worldwide understand that the plus sign is the indicator for international dialing access. I apologize for that for a moment. So what is string externalization? Quite simply, a piece of software is made up theoretically of two parts. The first part is what the software does. The second part is how it communicates with the user. So when writing the software, the programmer can include this interface part, typically called a UI or GUI, as part of the hard coding in the functional part of the code. Unfortunately, that means that if you wanted to have the software in more than one language, then you would need to essentially have a version of the code for each language. So in internationalization parlance, we undertake something called string externalization. For example, if you're writing in Java, rather than translating the string in the Java source file and having to create a new executable for each language, as well as a new set of code for each language, you use resource bundles to redirect the string through a properties file, which would be a repository of the strings for the UI. Taking, for example, the properties, in this case, obviously, it's called a file. The file is called .properties. This would contain those values, those language values. So, what tools do we have to help us with this? Well, outside of a full audit, and if you're completely confident that you have a world-ready application, but wanted to be completely sure, then you could undertake a process called pseudo-translation or localization. Pseudo-translation automatically generates translations that mimic the target language. Pseudo-translations are not real strings and contain typically complete gibberish. However, pseudo-translation often uses the same characters as the real translations and takes into account text expansion of the specific language, for example. This helps test how the UI will work in the target language before actual translation. Pseudo-translations can also be used to visually find hard-coded strings. So in this slide, you see that we opened up MS Paint for the purposes of doing a pseudo-translation. The interesting item here is that the string rotate by angle was apparently not externalized and therefore presents an internationalization issue. In addition, there are areas in which not enough room is left for text expansion since some of the text here is cut off. Here you see another approach to pseudo-translation in which brackets are used to indicate the opening and closing of the string. And that's important because that will allow you to see if the text was cut off or not. At this point, it pays to mention a little bit about text expansion. When languages are translated, we typically experience text expansion, and in some rare cases, text contraction. Understanding how and which languages expand or contract is important in localization, as it impacts in a very meaningful manner how we prepare our software for localization. The reasons for this are because each language behaves differently in terms of grammar, syntax, word usage, terminology, sentence structure, etc. In addition, subject matter also plays a role in the degree that since some languages need to be more descriptive. So, if I'm looking at what numbers to take into account as regards text expansion, well, of course, there will always be exceptions. And I recommend that you look at the information I'm providing here only as a reference. The real way to assess your product is by undertaking a localization readiness assessment. This typically can be done by a consultant or even by your vendor. So looking at this table, which includes data taken from MSDN, you will see figures pertaining to text expansion given the number of source characters and the minimum additional room required. Now, for you out there who may have gotten different statistics, I want to point out that this is taken from past Visual Basic localization projects, so blame Microsoft if you must. Looking at this, you will notice that the text expansion can range from 100% to 10%. In other words, if we look in this column here, we see the number of source characters in the string and the amount of characters that you have to take into account to account for text expansion. So if you have 1 to 4 characters, then you need to have a space of up to 8 characters to take into account additional growth for the localized strings. If you have more than 50 characters, then you don't have to leave about 55 character spaces. Now I'd like to mention a very touchy issue. That is one of concatenated strings. String concatenation is the operation of joining two character strings end to end. For example, the concatenation of mobile and phone is mobile phone, and this works great in English. Other uses of concatenation entail the use of variables, for example. If I need to represent the number pulled from a database within a string, I could say, well, your total deposit is $59. Then 59 could be indicated as a variable in the software, and the concatenation would work as such. So where's the problem? This, again, I'll admit, is taken from MSDN as well. By the way, it's a very helpful resource if you're interested. Just Google it. The main problems in concatenation is that not all languages work in the same way. So there are issues such as word order, gender, and even translation issues, which we'll look at in a minute. So why would a developer concatenate? Well, it saves them room, and they've been taught to do so. I had a case just this past week where we were contracted to do QA. At the very start of the project, we pointed out concatenation issues to the customer along with our recommendations. The customer's in-house linguist was very upset that each time they changed one string to the correct grammatical form, it made two others incorrect. We're hopeful that the customer will take us up on our recommendations. So let's look for a moment at how concatenation works. And I'm using an example from PHP just because that's probably a simple language. But you would be more familiar with using variables in documentation, specifically single sourcing platforms. So here we see how we can take two strings together and create one output. The first variable is hello world, and the next is what a nice day. And this works pretty well together. So now let's look at a different text. The cat and is large may be combined to form a sentence, the cat is large. Let's look how that would play out when translated. Now, I'm bilingual, and I've studied a couple other languages, in high school, of course. Every other language that I've studied or know has gender tenses for nouns. Now, I cannot go here into the nuances of how different languages use adjectives and nouns, but suffice to say that however they're used, there must always be noun-verb or noun-adjective agreement for the language to work correctly. Concatenation makes this more difficult. As you can see here, the phrase would be easily translatable. You would typically, for these languages, choose the male tense. Keep in mind that as far as I know, that these are language rules, not any sort of statement of inequality, of course. So this simple example makes it easy, but the real advantage of concatenation is that you need to describe the cat in hundreds of ways. Then the cat stays the same, and you use variables to add the attribute, except that if the cat is always masculine, then how would you describe it as being pregnant? I feel pity for that poor cat, of course. So here is illustrated just one problem with concatenating strings and the reasons for avoiding the practice. So at this point, you may be asking yourselves, well, why should I care about this, and how does this help me? Well, all this would really depend, naturally. The more involved you get in the software process, the more valuable you are likely to become to your team, and this naturally can lead you to being able to create more of your own value, and that which expands beyond just documentation. So let's talk a little bit about the UI translation more in depth than we covered earlier. Part of what we pointed out was the pre-processing. Of course, part of the pre-processing includes scoping the project for the level of effort and the costs. This can give us an idea of how to plan for the localization process. It is crucial that you understand that localization is a labor-intensive human process, and if you're leading the efforts in localization for your organization, then you must leave enough time for quality localization effort. Earlier, we had mentioned terminology work. Well, that terminology work begins with creating a good glossary of terms that will include enough metadata to make this meaningful. This includes the term itself, the definition of the term, any context that you can give it, where it comes from, part of speech, to name a few. So how do you go about creating this? The first thing is to prepare the material that is to be localized. From here, you will need to extract the relevant term candidates, adding the previously mentioned metadata, validating the term candidates, translating them, and then validating the translation. Once this is done, you may now import the terminology database into your tool. So here we see an example of an online terminology database that includes the term and the appropriate metadata. This slide and the next, by the way, were taken from the European Central Bank terminology as presented by Catherine Lane. And here we see an example of an online tool to edit the terminology. So now that you're overwhelmed by this terminology task, I can assure you that your translation partner is usually equipped to set up the terminology database for you. The next step after creating a terminology database is to train the resources in your application in the same way that a new technical writer doesn't normally start to pound out user guides on the first day. He or she needs time to learn the product. So we therefore need to give the translators time and tools to learn the product in order for him or her to create a meaningful translation. Once trained, the glossary is translated and becomes the terminology database. We then revert back to the previously discussed process for translation. As I mentioned earlier, one of the important activities associated with post-processing is automated testing. Often what can happen is that more than one translator will work on a product over the lifetime of the product, and if you do not enforce good processes, you can have a situation as shown here in which what obviously should be a glossary term is translated inconsistently, even if it does appear in the glossary. Automatic testing uses industry standard tools such as QA Distiller and can help you identify terms that have been incorrectly and inconsistently translated. Here you see that the source identifies life cycle as having been inconsistently translated in 2 instances at least. So here you see the source segment where the arrow is, and below the source segment it says has been translated in 2 different ways, and you see the 2 different ways. At this point we can then proceed to localization testing, which covers 3 distinct types: cosmetic, linguistic, and functional. Translation has an enormous impact on the cosmetic quality of an application. Nothing can change the fact that German strings will be longer than the English source. Almost any localization project will require some level of cosmetic testing. Cosmetic testing ensures that the layout, appearance, size, and alignment of all on-screen text, as well as the order of fields and tabbing, still makes sense post-translation. This entails looking closely at the content to ensure that the characters appear correctly, and that concatenation doesn't, that's a tough word by the way, people. Concatenation doesn't adversely affect the meaning. Linguistic testing makes sure that the translation is contextually correct. For instance, the translator may only see a string during the translation which says file. Does this mean a computer file? Does this mean a nail file, a wood file, a physical file? Maybe it's a verb. Maybe it's a noun. You could see here where it says dictionary, I just threw file into an English-French dictionary, and I came up with about 16 different items. And down here, just some visuals. Is it this kind of a file? Is it this kind of a file? Is it this kind of a file? Each of these would, of course, have a different translation. During functionality testing, the following may be checked: installation and setup on localized machines running localized operating systems and local page codes, text input including the use of extended characters or non-Latin scripts, menu functions, core application functions, string handling, text and data, especially when interfacing with non-Unicode applications or modules, regional settings defaults, text handling such as copying, pasting, and editing of extended characters, special fonts, and non-Latin scripts, hotkey shortcuts without any duplication. Functionality testing verifies that an application is still fully functional after localization. Even applications which are professionally internationalized according to World Readiness Guidelines require functionality testing. In-country review, while in some instances is, when not otherwise possible, handled by the language vendor itself, more typically can be achieved by using resources available to you within your company or your company's distribution network. In essence, it takes native-speaking stakeholders and allows them to review the product, which they themselves will eventually market or support. It is crucial to onboard these resources, as they sometimes can hold the key to your product's success in that region. It also allows these stakeholders to have a say in which terminology is used, the style, and so on. Ultimately, it will improve the quality and reduce time to market, and create a partnership with your distribution network and reduce costs, but it needs to be done correctly and with foresight. So you might ask now, what is my place in this process, and how can I get more involved? Well, the key here is to be as proactive as possible. Understand that your opinion matters. If the UI people want to name a button, you need to be part of that process, and you need to place yourselves in positions of influence. You need to take a leading role in managing the terminology and be a bridge with the in-country reviewers. You need to insert yourselves also into the UI review process. So now we come to the part which you are no doubt familiar, and I will not spend too much time dwelling on this. You need to lead the quality effort. Obviously, if you had a say in which translators or translation agency is used, or quite often, even if you had no say, you own the documentation and you own those translations by extension. So if you've done a good job, you can reap the benefits. If not, be prepared to pay the price. Probably one of the most important things you can do is to firstly verify that the tool set you have chosen fully supports the languages you want to translate into, now and also in the future. The cost of migrating, as I mentioned earlier, to a different tool set after translation is enormous, and you may have to answer for not making a better choice. Look at the quality criteria you want, and you will need to determine what things are most important to you. And finally, take charge and act according to the criteria you have set out. In terms of authoring tools, as I mentioned, look at all your needs. It doesn't matter what tool you use for authoring, as long as you have taken into account your internal as well as your localization needs. So in terms of your part in the documentation localization process, well, it's crucial to have a content review with localization in mind. One mistake is easier to fix than the number of mistakes multiplied by the number of languages. Understand that everything has costs. It is irrelevant if you're paying that cost up front or it is backloaded. For example, if you send your document out for translation and you get 3 different quotes, each one very different from the other, you need to ask yourself why. Am I translating the document or localizing the document? Am I using a professional translator who is well versed in the material, or am I going for the cheapest low-cost option? I want to take now a few minutes and demystify these costs so you can understand what they are and what you may eventually have to pay. So, in terms of the project setup, what costs will you have to deal with? And I've separated this, and you can see that there is some repetition because some of these activities can be performed either by yourselves or by your vendor. So I've mentioned earlier the content review, the glossary creation, pre-DTP. These are all things that can be done by either party. And by the way, this pre-DTP is prepares the source files for translation. By pre-DTP, we're talking again about documentation, of course. And of course, there's always project management. Since you may choose to do some of these activities yourselves, then these are hidden costs. The vendor can take on many of these activities at a far lower cost than you can, and this includes content review, the glossary creation, the engineering, and so on. And typically, these would be hourly charges. So you may want to know, what exactly do the localization engineers do? Localization engineering entails deconstructing the development environment of a product and reconstructing it later on, after all the text has been translated. This means preparing the material for localization, creating the translation kit, parsing the UI files, determining the best tool for the job, extracting the text for translation, either leveraging the TM or aligning previous translations, and after translation, to recreate the targets of the localized content, resize the dialog boxes, do the buttons, localize the graphics, have the screenshots prepared, prepare the test bed, and undertake the testing. These are all items that may be included in the localization engineering section. But of course, in most cases, the main cost driver is the word count. Any quote you receive should include what we refer to as TEP. Understand, too, that there might be different rates for different types of content or subject matter. If you get a lowball figure and you have a medical device, you can pretty well rest assured that you're not getting someone with intimate knowledge of the medical industry as your translator. These costs are almost always based upon source word count, but may also change based upon urgency or upon the amount of TM matching. TM matching incorporates 4 different types: new words, repetitions, 100% match words, and fuzzy match. Each of these have their own cost structure and may both be broken down further. Here is an example at the arrow you see, that's the column it's interesting, of a Passalo log that shows in the column marked by the arrow a total of 1,412 words, but only 1,054 need to be translated. This is for UI translation, as Passalo is one of the premier UI translation tools. This log from Trados Studio shows a project of roughly 100,000 words with a roughly 35,000 repetition and almost 80,000 new words for translations. This indicates that the content has not been translated. This is the log for the older version of Trados, showing a total of roughly 283 words for translation with 170 new words, 9 repetitions, 200% matches, balanced and fuzzy categories ranging from 50 to 99%, and I'll explain these in a moment. Finally, we see here a log from SDLX that shows a total of around 1,200 words in 2 files, 106 words in the 50% to 74% category, a few words in the 75 to 84% category, a few words in the 85 to 94%. In each category, if you've translated before, each category will get a different level of matching. So, what is a 100% match? Simply put, it is a segment of text in the text to be translated, normally called a translation unit, that contains text that is a match to a segment in the translation memory repository that has been translated previously. A repetition is simply put, a segment of text that repeats itself within the same set of files that have been analyzed. You will notice 2 more categories which are similar to one another. That is context TM category on the middle right and middle left, and the perfect match category, which only appears in the middle left. Firstly, the similarities between them are that both perfect match and the context TM look not only at the matching segment itself, but also at the context of the segment in terms of the 2 segments that come before and after. If those 2 match, they are called either perfect or context. The difference between the context and perfect matches are that the context match requires that the segments be in a file of the same name, for example, product user guide. And this makes updating a version more cost-effective, as you're able to, in some cases, to lock certain segments. So how do you get to the fuzzy categories and what do they mean? The calculation is not typically based on a complicated linguistic algorithm, but rather on the amount of characters, including spaces. So in the example of the lazy brown fox jumped over the quick brown dog, we see that there are 50 characters, including spaces. If we interchange dog and fox, we notice that 4 of the characters have changed, and this would be in a category of 85 to 94%. And I mentioned 4 characters because, as you can see, the O does not change. In addition to the text, the TM tools can also add what we call penalties for things such as formatting differences and so on. You will see here a number of other penalties. And it's important to point out that the penalties are there in order to be able to produce a higher quality document at the end of the day. And if you'd like a further explanation of these, by the way, you can send me an email and I'll send you some additional explanations. So how would this formatting penalty work? Using, again, the same example, we see that the text is the same, but if we had a 1% formatting penalty, when the format of the Word doc would introduce a 1% penalty, making this a 99% match, irrespective of the similarity of the text. This means that, depending on the tool used, the translator or the engineers would have to manage to keep the format the same, and that means another set of hands touching this document. This, by the way, is one of the real advantages of using an XML-based tools, since you will see issues such as this mostly in Word documents or other types of more graphical, what you see is what you get tools. So we spoke earlier about the other categories, but I just wanted to take a look at them again for a moment, since they give us additional options and raise other issues such as, should I auto-propagate? Do I need to review repetitions? How much review do I need to do? And on the 100%, the perfect matches, and so on. So now that we've spoken about technical aspects, I want to take a moment to speak about your project manager. The project manager is normally the key contact person at your vendor for localization. The level of professionalism of the project manager dictates in many cases the success of your project. If your vendor's project managers are nothing more than dispatchers, your experience may not be as smooth as you would like. You need to choose a vendor who can deliver a project manager that speaks your language, both figuratively and literally. By this I mean that if you have to explain what a QSG or Quick Start Guide is, then you might also have to explain many more things that you may assume that the project manager knows. So if you're in the process of vetting a new vendor, take this into account. You might even want to ask to have a project manager sit in on one of the pre-sale meetings. The project manager needs to manage budgets, schedules, deliverables off of the project manager. If your project is into, say, translated into 30 languages, maybe managing as many as 100 people, since there are translators, reviewers, proofreaders, engineers, graphics people, QA and testing people, all combining to make your product locale ready. In addition to all that, they're also tasked with reporting status, managing the invoicing and billing, and a good project manager should look to bring value to each project and each customer in the goal to make them happy and satisfied. So looking at the overall process again, let's for a moment look at how we can make sense of everything we discussed here. In any localization effort, the process starts with a readiness check. This should include checking for all the internationalization and localization issues which we discussed. Upon completion of this, we then move to training the translators and preparing the groundwork for successful localization. This includes glossary and terminology work. Parallel to this, we need to undertake the technical preparation of the files and create a localization kit, which includes leveraging the translation memory, incorporating the glossary, and adding any additional reference. At this point, the UI is then translated and reviewed. Upon completion, and as mentioned earlier, the software is then compiled in the local languages and tested. Once the testing and verification has been done, we prepare the screenshots for the documentation and then move forward with the documentation translation. Again, a translation kit is prepared, and not only is the translation memory and glossary incorporated, but so are the UI strings incorporated into the translation memory and as a reference dictionary. Once the documentation goes through the translation process, it is then either laid out in the graphical format or used to generate the help or other targets, depending upon the source format. Irrespective of the format, the final version then undergoes QA and QC, and the language assets, meaning the translation memories and glossaries, should be updated with any and all fixes. A post-mortem should then take place to see how the process can be improved, if at all. I hope this sort of helps to bring together everything we spoke about just now. So I hope that you come away today with a better understanding of the goings-on in the localization project and are well-equipped to explain it to your organization, also about the differences between localization, internationalization, and translation. Finally, I hope that I've also helped empower you to add more value to yourselves and by extension to your organizations. Lastly, I hope that those of you who are currently involved in localization will come away with a better appreciation of your project manager. Now, just while we're getting some of these questions together, I just want to mention a couple of words about NetTranslators. NetTranslators was founded in 2001 and has locations in 4 countries, providing localization services into more than 60 languages. With a unique, one-of-a-kind multilingual QA center, we take a high-value approach to multilingual testing and are able to deliver more value by leveraging our unique capabilities in testing. We provide the full range of localization across key verticals and are certified to the most stringent industry standards. NetTranslators is a standout provider of localization services, recognized worldwide and by top 10 reviews, which for 3 years in a row has recognized us as the #1 translation vendor. Thank you again all for joining me today. I hope this webinar has given you a better understanding of the processes, and if you would like to get in touch with me personally, I invite you to send me an email to the address that appears on the screen. At this point, I'm going to grab these questions. Hold on one moment. Okay, so my colleague handed me two questions. The first one is, can you let me know more about the localization maturity model? I'd be interested in hearing more about how this is applied and where my company is. So actually, I wish I could claim credit for that. Don De Palma has an article, and I found it on the Gallup website, regarding the localization maturity model. It's an interesting article to read because it applies many of the CMM standards. Okay, one last question. I think we have time for one last question. Yes, okay, good. My company has been translating for a few years, but we never created any glossaries. Our UI is pretty large, as is our help. What is your suggestion on how to create the glossary now? Well, that's actually a pretty good question, and it's not as rare as you would imagine. A lot of companies sort of just jump feet first to translation. Oh, we have to translate this because we got that request, and then after you're really engaged in it, after a while, you realize that you can improve these processes. You don't have to go back to the beginning. What you can do is you can actually mine your translation memories for key terms, and what you'll find is that the translations typically will be there. Now, obviously, you'll have to do some work on fixing them up and making sure that they're consistent. But that's one way of going about that. You can also just look at the English language content and create it from the English language content as well. But it's important, as I think I pointed out earlier in the webinar, that if you're going to look at both the UI as well as the documentation, that you have to extract even the same term from the UI. Essentially, I'm sure that you guys are all familiar with this, but if you've had a string that needed to be shortened, for example, in the UI, you wouldn't necessarily shorten that string in the documentation. You'd want a more fuller explanation of it. So that can be solved, and if you have any more questions about that, please feel free to shoot me an email. Okay, being signaled that we're going to end this now if nobody has any additional questions. And thank you all for attending, and I wish you good localization.